place, make sure you refer to them. It's all yours. But if you step out of line, that's it. We're back. So my critique of that, and some people have taken this as a kind of anti-colonial critique. My critique was to say, if you were a political subject on the receiving end of that kind of strategy, the chances are you would see it as a colonial occupation. And I think it's exactly what we see happening to some degree in Timor, much more so, of course, in Afghanistan and Iraq, with the fragmented secular, fragmented kind of identity-style politics that we see emerging there. So in a sense, that move was predictable. Once you start getting involved in that sort of, well, okay, we know the answer to peace, it's the liberal institutional state. We can impose the empty shell of the state. It doesn't matter if it's not relevant. People will move into it. We'll use force at some point. We'll hand it over to you. But once you start to do that, you're putting an awful lot of faith in the self-censorship of human agency, the way in which individuals will defer their responsibilities and their agency, their capacity, will accept this superior modern knowledge that you purport to be bringing to the table about what peace means and how it's created. And my sense of the response to that, as it was developing in the late 90s and early 2000s, when I was doing the research for that book, was actually this is not really the way people are taking it at all on the ground. The response to that kind of strategy, on the point of view of international donors, including in the UN system, was one of resistance. There were small-scale resistant agencies emerging, at the elite right through civil society down to the local level. Now, when I say resistance, I'm not thinking about old-style national liberation movements. I'm not thinking about some kind of grand political mobilization for self-determination. I'm thinking about political debate and contestation. So as we see peace building moving away from the discussion about root causes, of course it's still there in the literature, it's mentioned in the capstone document. As we see it moving away from an attempt to deal with material needs, instead focusing on rights frameworks as a kind of substitute for the lack of material capacity of many donors. As we see it moving away from issues relating to consent and reconciliation in the late 90s, we see it moving into a kind of counterinsurgency mode. And the counterinsurgency mode is to be, a process whereby peacekeepers, military forces, peace enforcers provide a basis in which international technocrats can come in, build the non-liberal, liberal institutional state. And this kind of paradox, I think, would not be received well on the ground. As a kind of caveat, or I didn't ask you, by the way, how long have I actually got for this talk? Because I'm... I better ask you that before I go any further.
30 minutes.
Right. As a kind of caveat to that, there is then the issue of, well, how does the liberal respond to the local? How do liberal international actors within the donor system, within the international architecture, engage with political subjects in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Asia, in, let's say, Timor, Cambodia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guatemala, El Salvador, and so forth? And I did a bit of work on how I felt that internationals perceived local actors, from the elites down to grassroots actors. And of course, it's difficult to generalize, but I'm going to generalize just for the sake of simplicity. With the exception that I think many international donors, peace builders, human rights workers, aid workers, and so forth are nuanced and very sensitized. I think in general, the way in which the peace-building community is channeled into behaving in certain ways through their rules of engagement, through their policy documentation, through their job descriptions, and through their future prospects, in other words, the kind of professionalization of peace-building. They are really required to distance themselves from those people who are receiving peace-building. Distance is necessary to maintain authority, to maintain the sanctity of the liberal peace system in its various different subsections, whether it's rule of law programming, DDR, whether it's human rights, whether it's democratization, whether it's economic reform, and so forth. And that kind of distancing process, I think, is generally adopted by agencies and donors, because they have great pressures on them to be pragmatic, to select priorities, to engage in certain areas that they feel are necessary. But the unintended consequence of that distancing means it makes the project, again, look quite colonial. Now, note I'm not saying it is a colonial project. I'm saying that the way it's received on the ground may not be quite the way it's expected by the internationals. If you remember in the early 1990s, when the whole peace-building, peacekeeping development was gaining momentum, we had this sense in the West that these great operations in, let's say Somalia, Bosnia, would be welcomed on the ground. People would open their arms to them, see them as liberators. There would be a liberatory context to international intervention. It's strange how we seem to have forgotten that in our international agencies. The notion that the recipient should be willing, should give consent, should recognize the neutrality and impartiality, the reconciliation content, the engagement with root causes, all of that's been swept away. Because I think we've been diverted into this kind of state-building formula in which the empty shell of the state has taken precedence over the everyday lived experiences of people who want peace. So this distancing project makes it look rather Foucauldian. So the Foucauldian critique of liberal and Marxist politics in the 1970s and 1980s becomes quite relevant here. It makes it look governmental. It makes it look biopolitical. And the next step from that kind of argument is to say, again, it will be resisted. So rather than being welcomed as liberators, rather than engaging with, let's say, the substantive components of emancipation through empathetic means, dealing with root causes, and the long-standing political problems which might lead to conflict, we've been diverted to dealing with building states. And the state, it seems, is a simple architecture, a simple liberal architecture, through which various blueprints can be deployed universally, wherever you might find yourself, in order to rectify certain aspects of conflict. So the priorities, the selection, the process, the procedures, and the architecture have all been defined externally, with some response to conflict experiences, but rather a response to, let's say, the material restrictions, the ideological expectations, and the normative standards that have been developed elsewhere, externally. So what does this mean? We have a kind of peace building emerging which rests on peacekeeping as counterinsurgency. We don't engage with root causes, even though it's there, very clear in all the literature. We don't really engage with socio-economic problems unless it's through the long-term prospects of the market or through emergency assistance. We certainly don't even bother with reconciliation these days. In fact, it seems that making peace these days really only includes your friends, not your enemies. So you have these sorts of contorted processes whereby you try to exclude actors who are deemed spoilers, who are deemed beyond the pale, who don't conform to a set of normative standards. That sounds rather easy on paper. Of course, we know it doesn't work. Just look at Afghanistan and the whole question about the Taliban these days. Do you include them? Do you not? Can you have peace without Taliban? Can you not? If they include 40% of the population, you may have a problem if you try to exclude them. How do you negotiate that kind of situation, given that most of the norms that they represent, the systems, processes, defy liberal international standards, women's rights, let's say Sharia law, the way in which identity is manipulated politically, the kind of enclosure of political rights, and so forth. Now, I'm not saying I have any answers to that, but I think it's kind of indicative of the problem, one of the key problems that we now confront, which is how do you make peace building relevant to a wide range of constituencies, people like you and I, but many in a much worse position around the world, political subjects. How do we reconfigure this peace building project so it kind of connects with many of the norms in the Charter and the documentation of the UN, and also many of the, I think, important points and criteria included in the documentation of regional organizations, the international NGOs, and many donors. How do we actually make it consistent with that type of documentation? That would be a good start to make the liberal peace consistent with the liberal peace. Then, the next question is, how do we do it in a way which is relevant to the broader communities upon which it's being visited? Can we? I think we can. But how? In other words, how do we bring back redressal of root causes? How do we bring back a broader understanding of politics, context, culture, identity, tradition, custom? How do we mediate them with the liberal peace framework and system itself? How do we make peace with our enemies, not just with our friends? How can this form of peace, this post-liberal peace, be made contextual? And the third part of that kind of whole framework, which I'm still also thinking through, is What kind of feedback does that give to the liberal peace architecture? Given that we have this big architecture, very international, very regional, very embedded, as some North American theorists like to say, embedded liberalism and so on. How do we make it learn? How do we make it responsive? How do we make it more fluid, more flexible, more understanding? How do we make the liberal peace system go beyond its secularism, its rationalism, its material restrictions, its complicated and very localized balance of rights, privileges, expectations, the good life with restrictions, regulations, and so forth? This, to me, is a big political project, and why I'm so interested in peace building, state building, and peacekeeping, because I've always seen it really at the forefront of the mediation of the discipline of international relations and political science, of, let's say, the hegemonic expression of power, because this discipline is mainly a northern discipline. And it's many, many subjects who are coming now into this debate in policy terms, in practical terms, but also in intellectual terms from elsewhere around the world. And really, just as an aside, I think if we carry on down this track of taking peace building, peacekeeping and development into the areas of counterinsurgency, we won't have much left to talk about in a few years, because it will basically lose all legitimacy. So how do we get its legitimacy back? Well, it has to be grounded, it has to be contextualized. I was recently at the Brazilian Peacekeeping College, and I was very interested to learn that the Brazilian peacekeeping contingents are using their experience in Haiti, which, as we know, has been a very difficult peacekeeping environment for a long time, in the favelas. They're bringing it home. They're bringing peacekeeping home. Peacekeeping as counterinsurgency in Haiti is now being used as pacification in the favelas. It's being used as the basis for the extension of the reach of the state into these various locations in the big, big cities, which are lawless, which are, if you like, the basis of drug smuggling and drugs trade and various other unpleasant and highly corrupt and problematic projects. Is that what we see here now? Is that what we see with the experience of peacekeeping and peace building? We took it out to the former colonies, and then we bring it back, if you like. I think that's not the model we need to follow. So, how do we get it back? I suppose some simple propositions or avenues we can follow. Firstly, peacekeeping, peace building, and state building need to no longer be these kind of methodological and ethical free zones that they have been. Us researchers, particularly in the qualitative side of things, are held to very high methodological standards. There has to be informed consent, there has to be legitimacy all the way along the process, there has to be reciprocity, there has to be a recognition of the position of both the researcher and the subject. Why are these sorts of methodological requirements and ethical requirements not part of these sorts of debates? Why are the subjects of peacekeeping, peace building, really seen as guinea pigs in a grand experimentation process? That, for me, is very problematic, because it, again, distances them. It erodes their rights. It undermines the material restrictions of their everyday life. And indeed, it depoliticizes them. It takes away the kind of political rights that one would expect the liberal peace to provide. So there's a big methodological and ethical issue. Now, again, if you go to the UN documentation, there are hints of the potential to create something here. There are a range, I suppose, of specifications, of approaches from do no harm to the OECD DAC documentation and so forth, which claims that there is consideration in these sorts of areas. And I think certainly the peacekeeping aspect, the activity of peacekeeping, is one of the more regulated aspects of intervention from this perspective.